Hello, we're on to section 3 now of chapter 22. We're going to look at 3 case studies, which is a little more in depth at 3 different countries in the region that we are currently studying. So let's take a look at those together today: Turkey, Egypt, and Iran. At the beginning of the Cold War, the Soviets, of course, we've discussed several times, were trying to expand into Eastern Europe and also to the south into Turkey. And as Turkey was struggling to become more and more democratic and free, as we discussed last time, more liberal Muslim country and trying to modernize. And we'll take a look at its effect that Turkey has had recently. One major issue facing Turkey are the Kurdish nationals to the east and also in northern Iraq. And they have been trying to get their autonomy for quite some time. Also, the more secularized government in Turkey currently faces challenges by the radical fundamental Muslims who would prefer them to be harder on the non-Muslims. A big issue with Turkey as well is their request to enter the European Union since 1980, and they have not been accepted because of their human rights issues that Muslim countries face, so that's a bone of contention. And they were friends with the United States, but Turkey had agreed to allow the United States to use their bases to attack Afghanistan, or excuse me, to attack Iraq. But at the last minute, they pulled that uh, authorization, and the Fourth Army Unit had to attack through the Persian Gulf instead of from the north, from Turkey, which caused some trouble with the attack. Then on to Egypt. Shortly after World War II, Gamal Abdel Nasser set out to modernize uh, Egypt, nationalizing the Suez Canal from the British and saying, that the Egyptians were controlling it. Fighting with Israel, as we mentioned in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arab neighbors fought. Egypt was high on the list of anti-Israeli countries. The building of the Aswan High Dam also helped modernize and bring electricity and also irrigation to the dry parts of Egypt to help industrialize that. By the 1970s, Anwar Sadat came to power and began opening up Egypt any further, and he was the first Arab leader to shake hands with the Israeli leaders, and for that he was assassinated later in 1981 by radical members of his own military. Anwar Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak, continued to rule for 30 years as a dictator until the so-called Arab Spring of 2011, when Hosni Mubarak was toppled and the Islamic Brotherhood took control of Egypt, and then went back, changed hands back to the military, back to civilian Muslim control, and right now Egypt is still torn between leaders and who controls Egypt, whether it's the military or civilian Muslim politicians, because Hosni Mubarak is under trial as a dictator and is in poor health. Iran. Well, in the country of Iran, up until 1979, was controlled by the Shah of Iran, which means sort of king in the Farsi language. The Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, which was propped up by the CIA and supported by several United States presidents, became close friends with Jimmy Carter, Nixon, Ford, and they went on to become the leader, the Shah, for many years until 1979. In the 1970s, the radical Muslims in Iran were led by a figure called the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was in exile in Paris. And once the students revolted in 1979 against the Shah, he was forced to step down, and the students took over the United States Embassy and held hostages for many, many days, which was a very much embarrassment to America that this third world country like Iran was able to topple our embassy and hold many of our diplomats captive for so many days. And Khomeini, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was able to rule Iran for many years until his death, and now another Ayatollah rules. Even though they do have a president in Iran, the high Ayatollah, the Islamic leader, is really behind the scenes that makes all major decisions for Iran still today, the successor of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. So when the students took over and held those hostages for many days, this caused America to have very bad relations with Iran ever since. And now with the Iranians attempting to develop nuclear capabilities, this has caused much more bitterness with America. And eventually we got our hostages back, and later on we still have sanctions against Iran, although we've tried to work with them a little bit in trying to sort out the civil war in Iraq and neighboring Iraq. Iran today was labeled as one of the axes of evil by George W. Bush, and they continue to threaten the nuclear arsenal. And ever since 1989, a new Ayatollah has risen up, and extremely radical Muslim clerics issue fatwas or commands to kill Americans, to cause terror. Although more and more every day you hear of moderates rising up in Iran and who are demanding a more moderate government. So this is something we're going to want to keep our eye on in the news and see what direction they tend to head. The most recent major treaty was in Geneva in 2013, where concessions were made to Iran if they were to and we could relieve some of the sanctions if they were to give up on some of their nuclear ambitions.